Well, welcome everyone. We are so excited to launch our new television show to encourage and equip the body of Christ to extend the life and love of Jesus to our world. You know, in these challenging days, I have been reminded how much we need the love, the hope, the joy, the kindness, the goodness of Jesus working out through our lives. It's easy to forget the way of Jesus during these difficult days, to forget who we are and what we've been called to be. Today, we are looking at the healing power of Jesus in Mark chapter 5 and looking at how his way of love informs our way of love. Welcome to Westside.
You are always faithful. You will never leave. You are always faithful to me. Faithful to me. Faithful to me. Faithful to me.
On June 16, 2016, my life plunged into pitch black darkness when my oldest son, Chase, died in a car accident. The death of a child is like having a bright light suddenly extinguished in the middle of the night and not being able to see anything until your eyes adjust to the dark. It takes time. As little by little you begin to make out shapes and textures. The death of a loved one or the death of a relationship and even the death of our dreams all can send us to the edge of losing our faith. It's like a sudden shift from light to dark, and only very slowly does one begin to perceive what was once familiar. Maybe loss or death has invaded your life in a way you didn't anticipate, and you're trying to navigate your pain or that of those around you. I've been where you are. When life disappoints us and when you feel God has disappointed you, it's easy to lose hope. I've had to wrestle with God for myself, for my family, and even for my community. But what I've found is a God willing to listen to our cries and our questions. And what I've come to believe is actually stronger and more sustaining. My hope is that you'll find a safe place to explore your questions and doubts, or help a friend or family member do the same when life doesn't make sense. It will not illuminate your entire path, but it might help you take one more step.
You said if we seek, we will assuredly find. You keep drawing us close. We want to know you, God. We will stand. We will wait. We will worship.
Well, today we're looking at a passage in Mark chapter 5 where Jesus heals two people consecutively, an influential man's daughter and a woman who has been shunned by her society because of her illness. And so we're going to pick up the story in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. And then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, Jairus fell at the feet of Jesus and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death." I want you to hear the desperation in this father's voice. I want you to hear the desperation. I want you to see it. I want you to imagine what it must. He came to Jesus and fell at the feet of Jesus, imploring him, earnestly asking him, "Jesus, would you come? And my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And so Jesus went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And so this little girl, 12 years of age, is at the point of death, and this father with such great desperation comes to Jesus, right? And he just knows that if Jesus can get close to my daughter, if he can just lay his hands on my daughter, she'll be made well. And it's in that moment, right, as they're following Jesus and Jairus to his house, verse 25, there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years and who had suffered much under many physicians and had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. So in the middle of this woman shows up in the crowd. Nobody probably recognizes her. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how she ends up there. But she's there because she's had this illness for 12 long years, and she has tried everything. She has spent all of her money, and she's at her wit's end, and it's the last hope. I've got to get to Jesus. I got to get to Jesus. If I can get close to Jesus, if I can touch him, I will be made well, right? And so she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. She knew it. Right at that moment that she touched Jesus, she knew something had happened and that she had been healed. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd, the throngs of people crowding around Jesus, right? He turns around and, "Who touched me? Who touched my garments?" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. And we're going to talk about why did she come in fear and trembling, and fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." This woman had suffered from this disease for 12 years. So you got a 12-year-old girl, a 12-year-old daughter who is at the point of death, right? And then right in the middle of that story, you have this woman who's been suffering for 12 years. And it's interesting because of the type of disease that she had. The Old Testament, which the Jewish people were following during the time of Jesus, had declared that this woman would be unclean. Because of her illness, she would be unclean. And what that means is that everything she touched, everything she laid down on, everything she set upon would be considered unclean. Not only that, even people that she touched or touched her would be considered unclean. It means that she wasn't allowed to go to the temple. She wasn't allowed to be in contact with others. She wasn't allowed to go to the temple to offer sacrifices, to worship in her community for over a decade. She hadn't experienced any kind of touch or connection for 12 long years. You know, the quarantine over these past many months has been going on and off here in the state of Oregon for almost a year, and we're going crazy. I can't imagine being quarantined for 12 years. Not to mention the shame that comes along with being outcast, being the one person in your community who you can't interact with others. The shame that comes along with people when they see you, they walk to the other side of the street. They just stay a distance from you. They can't even come up and talk to you. And imagine the shame of coming to the temple. You want to worship your God and you're not allowed in, and people are yelling at you to leave and don't touch her. And that's what was going on in her life. And the desperation that she must have been experiencing, and she hears that Jesus is in town and maybe he can do something, and so she's going to risk it all. We're going to talk about that. But I want to, before we kind of dive even more deeply into this story, we have to go back 1,500 years to understand what's really happening in this story with Jesus. We have to go back to a guy named Moses. Now, around 1500 BC, Moses marched some 3 million Hebrews out of Egypt, a nation of slaves. And 3 days into their deliverance, they're thirsty, they start complaining, they're the only water available is this well, and that water turned bad, and so they're all really upset, and why did you take us out of Egypt? And God tells Moses to throw a branch, a tree, into the water, and when he does, that water will turn sweet. And then God says these words in Exodus chapter 15, verse 26. I am the Lord who heals you. He declares to the people of Israel who he is. In this moment of desperation, in this moment of the lack of water, God says, I am the God who heals you. This is significant because this is one of the first times, one of the first names that God gives himself after delivering the people from slavery. And it's the name Yahweh Rapha. And it means the Lord, your healer. 3 months later, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, right? And he receives the 10 Commandments, and God reminds him of what he did in delivering them from Egypt. And God says this to Moses, and he says to Moses, make sure you tell this to the people of Israel, that I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So we're going to bring these two things together. I am the God who heals you, and I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Yahweh Rapha, the Lord who heals, and the Lord who covers and protects you under the shadow of his wings, a place of refuge. Psalm 91. Moses probably wrote Psalm 91, which says, those who live in the shelter, the covering, the refuge of the Most High will find rest in the shadow of the Almighty. This I declare about the Lord. He alone is my refuge, my place of safety. He is my God, and I trust him. He will cover you with his feathers. He will shelter you with his wings. His faithful promises are your armor and protection. This woman, for 12 long years, considered unclean by the religious establishment, unworthy, unacceptable, religiously or physically, spiritually or otherwise, and all she wants and desires is to be protected, is to find some refuge and healing. But she can't get to where God is in the current religious system because of her uncleanness, let alone touch Jesus because of the system that had been kind of propagated for thousands of years, that she couldn't get to the place that she needed to find comfort and hope and healing and covering. She couldn't get there. Powerful moment in this narrative of this woman in so much desperation, willing to risk everything just to get to Jesus, to find healing and protection and covering. Not just, by the way, not just for her body, but also for her soul, for her emotion, for her peace, her shalom. Now, that's in this moment of this, like this narrative, right? This woman, all this is happening, and then we You remember Jairus? Remember his daughter? They were on their way to heal his daughter who was near death. And it's in this very moment of this woman's transformation that a word comes to Jairus. Now, I want you to imagine what Jairus must be thinking. What is he thinking? And they're on their way. His daughter is close to death, and this woman interrupts this whole thing. And what is Jairus thinking, right? I mean, he must be like, we got to go. Jesus, we got to go. I'm so glad that this is all happening, but we got to go. My daughter. And then in that moment of his desperation, he gets what I know to be the worst news a parent can receive. While Jesus was still speaking to the woman, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid. Only believe. Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of Jesus, to the house. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making such a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And of course, the child was dead. But Jesus' perspective on this whole thing of death and life, and it's just different than ours. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion? This child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Evidently, when you're dead and come back to life, you're hungry. And so Jesus took care of that little girl. Where do we go when everything falls apart? Where do we go with our questions and our doubts? Where do we go to get answers? Where do we go when we're broken and bleeding? Unfortunately, for far too long, the church has not been the place where people go to find healing and wholeness and connection. See, Jesus didn't just want to heal this woman of her illness or raise this girl from the dead. He wanted to heal them holistically. He wanted them to be part of this community. And he says to Jairus, "Peace be with you." At the end of the day, Jesus wants us to be in shalom with ourselves and with others and with God, to be at peace. And it's spiritual, it's social, it's emotional. And we've been weakened by years of brokenness, and we find ourselves at this day and this hour as people, even as a nation, anemic. We are hurting and we are broken and we have been bleeding, and we need the healing touch of Jesus now more than ever. And soon, it says in Matthew 14, people were bringing all their sick to be healed. They begged Jesus to let the sick touch and at least the fringe of his robe. And all who touched him, were healed. All who came into proximity with Jesus the Christ were healed. The one task of the church today is to help people come into proximity with Jesus, to remove barriers that cause people to stay away and to feel rejected and to feel like they're not part of, to remove barriers to say all are welcome to come and sit at the feet of Jesus so that you also can reach out and touch the garment, to touch the corner of his robe. How desperate are we to be made whole today? How desperate are you to see true reconciliation and redemption in your life and in your relationships and in your body? Are you as desperate as a father about to lose a child? Are you as desperate as a woman who had been shunned by society for over a decade and everything she had tried had failed? Are you desperate? How desperate are you? Sometimes we have to get to a place of despair and hopelessness before we reach out to Jesus. I'm here today to tell you that from my own personal experience, that Jesus has risen with healing in his wings. He has risen to call us sons and daughters. He has risen to give us peace, shalom, wholeness, well-being, prosperity, and security in our very being. Jesus is the author and the perfecter of all that he's working in our lives. It was June 2016 when we got the word that our oldest son, had been killed in a car accident. And though it's been several years, the grief is still very real and very present in our journey. And I've often told others who have lost children, you don't get over some things. It's not like you get over that and everything's fine. You just kind of figure out how to walk through it and in the midst of it. And in my deepest, darkest pain, I was reminded, I continue to be reminded that there is hope in Jesus. That I can't make it without him. You can't make it without him. I can't find peace and wholeness and connection and community except by moving closer into proximity with Christ and grabbing the edges of his robe. So will you join me today in running into the shelter of his wings? Will you reach out with me today to get close enough to Jesus just to touch one of his garments? Will you, as representatives of Christ in his body, the church, open up your doors and your homes and your arms wide to embrace those who are broken and bleeding in our communities? Will you let your light shine so that all can experience the transforming, healing power of Jesus today? The words of Jesus to this father in his greatest moment of desperation are the same words that he whispers to each of us today. Don't be afraid, just believe.
This is not a stage. The lights of the show, the roar of the crowd, have no place in this grand auditorium. The theater is vast, but the audience is one. Lofty phrases echo throughout, but the applause is saved for the simple. It is here that we meet with God. He is your Father. He knows you. When we fumble over our words, He responds, pray like this. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, as above, so below. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen.